Well, thank you very much. All right, well, thank you very much for coming on this very cold night, I know. Nobody really wants to go out. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here and to bring this exhibition. At some point, I was not quite sure this is going to happen, so I'm very, very happy. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about, let's say, I call it a philosophy, our foundry philosophy, which in a way goes in the inside and outside, both ways. For those of you who don't know TT, this is Jose Scaglione, my business partner who wanted to be a rock star and almost made it. Yeah. but he still plays the bass. He still has a... And I met Adi and Sarah in our young days in Reading a long time ago. So I founded TypeTogether with Jose over a decade ago, about 13 years ago, and I like to call it a small global company because by now we have our team, our core team, it's pretty mixed, and it is actually global, except that, of course, we don't have anybody in Africa or down south and Russia. Although actually, no, that's not true. We do have somebody now in Russia. So we don't have a studio, like a classic kind of studio. We work really digitally online in a kind of virtual way, let's say. And so this is what I was saying, kind of from the inside. We do have an increasingly strong idea and stance on multiculturalism, on multi-script, of course, and kind of this multidisciplinary work. We have regular online meetings. Like this year was in Italy this year. We have a lot of fun. But we usually do some kind of educational workshop stuff, and we like our kind of diversity in that. As part of this, let's say, broader extended family, we call it, a lot of collaborators. Because we really, one of our main points of philosophy points is collaboration. So we believe in a very fruitful way of working together, kind of creating a creative synergy. So become more of the sum of parts, right? And to give also to show the people behind the work is really important, we think, to celebrate their work. So we are really a foundry, indie foundry, with a very special focus on editorial design. And that was not originally, but very much built on trust and mutual respect. Originally just me and Jose, and now this bigger team. For us, kind of legibility function of a typeface or of a whole family is really important, right? So the kind of fonts have to be vehicles of information, of communication. We take care of quality, and we kind of really try to push our work a bit further. And in that way, we also work a lot with different clients, and we move more and more into kind of multi-script, into the multi-script world, let's say. This is just like kind of a little video we did to show a little bit our general work. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about these different scripts we've been doing, focusing on really some kind of key work. And today, nowadays, of course, it's not just print, but you have to consider a lot of different environments, now mainly the digital environment. We work, but one other kind of part of us is very much educational work we do. We don't quite, well, we are not permanent teachers, but both Jose and me, and actually a lot of the team, do workshops or talks and kind of promote type in a broader sense. And we also kind of in the same sense of giving an idea of who's behind the work, we try to give an idea of some background information or perhaps even educational content, like the anatomy series we have for Devanagari, we have Arabic and Greek, so it's kind of an extra additional work. And actually this kind of content building has been quite important part of the Foundry. And as part of this, we also created about 5 years ago the scholarship. It used to be the Type Incentive Program, but because Xheight Unger, our really mentor and teacher and very good friend, he died last year, in his honor, we renamed it. And the most recent graduate is Laima, if I can get it, yeah, who from Den Haag. We just published that. So the kind of the scholarship really gives the designer, it changed a little bit in format. We have more money now to give to them, and it's more of the current one is more of like an internship. So he really works with us with the different team members. So really just to kind of sum up our philosophy, let's say, these are key points for us that we believe make our company what it is. And we really believe in this attitude, especially good karma. For me, that's one of the main points to kind of give. If you are good, you receive good back, so to speak. So I call it global reach because this is kind of the exercising this idea of diversity and multifaceted ideas to the outside as well. This kind of diversity with our catalog, and a bit Reading, sparked some interest in the multi-script. Our group was very diverse. And so we started moving into different scripts. We have pretty much these in our catalog. Some of it is work in progress, really. And we started expanding some of our families with, the easy one, the Cyrillic and the Greek for the time being. But it's a lot about kind of trying to, so if you go from a base, take the base Latin, you don't just copy paste stuff. You kind of try to figure out a way of taking the spirit and the style of the base typeface and transfer these ideas and the spirit of it to the other script, which can be easier or harder. And we've also done this it's just a small part of Pan-African. So this is one of the things I was saying with good karma, because we give the Pan-African away for free to whoever kind of NGOs. And of course, Noam, sorry, this is really fast. I didn't mean it to be so fast. Yeah. I didn't want to take that much space. But anyway, this is just to give you a bit of an idea, really, what that our Foundry is moving a lot into the kind of multi-script idea. And we also started working a few years ago with founder type. So the scripts, some of them are very easy, like the Cyrillic. Others are a bit more complicated to harmonize. Adi will be speaking a lot about that, how that worked out with Noam, because it's not really, you don't you need to take into account the typographic nuances or not regulations, but rules or orthographies. So when you combine different scripts, it's not just taking something, let's say, out of the Latin, and the same logic is not going to work in let's say Thai, yeah. Not necessarily, because you have a very different ductus, very different shapes. But nevertheless, you need to try to find a way of how do you make these two scripts work alongside. And some goes for the really the spirit. So here, like in Arlette, you have this very kind of playfulness, and how do you transfer that into a Thai that can be very playful with all these the so-called loops. But then you can have something like that, which is the loopless Thai, which looks very different from the looped version. Yeah. Or how do you combine Bengali and Latin? Or the Devanagari, so where the Devanagari actually has a completely different stress, yeah, because the tool is very different. So these are kind of questions when you start to work with a different script that you don't know, you can't read, you don't actually understand it. You have to really look into doing research, into looking at sources, and not just digital sources, but really ideally go and see original manuscripts and understand how the tool worked. To then derive these shapes, and then also, of course, kind of translating the style into the new script. And one good way doing that is keeping an eye on the weight. Yeah, so Adi will be looking at that, but on the weight. And we've been, because a lot of our families are very big, they're for editorial design, right? So, and a lot of these other scripts historically don't have heavy styles. So sometimes you have to perhaps even invent a solution for that. Okay, and I think that was pretty much it from me. Actually, my next pet project is a Korean. I would love to do a Korean. I don't know if I'll get the funding for it, but that's my. The Chinese is not ours. This is from founder type. But what we did with them was to match our Latin with one of their actually a few families. But even here, we had to kind of adjust the baseline, because of course in Chinese you don't have the same thing like in Latin. You don't really have a baseline, and also the weight distribution is a bit different. So yeah, that was I give over to Adi.
Yeah, okay, that was easy. I can't really see you, but I hope you're there. You're still there. It's great being here. Thank you so much for having me, the TDC, Carol, and thank you for coming. I will speak very briefly about the history of the Hebrew script, the alphabet, very, very briefly, but just give you some kind of context. Then I'll talk about the development of Noam Text, the typeface that I've designed, and then lastly I will speak a bit and elaborate about the process and the journey that I made with this. So, without further ado, what's that? Okay, so as I said, a very concise history of the Hebrew script. It all started back then, 3rd century. I mean, those are the earliest findings that we have of the Hebrew that we know now, that we can read. It's the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD. And as you can see, it's quite nicely done. It's the typeface is kind of hung from like a laundry line, instead of having a baseline. And it's a very low contrast type, so to speak, type or style, and it was made with a reed, basically. Later, we see mostly inscriptions, stone-cut inscriptions, burial inscriptions, and some mosaic lettering. Not very many examples, but those are some of them. This is from the 3rd century AD. Again, no contrast. It seems like it was not very well done. And it was kind of a trial to imitate handwriting in stone cutting, and as well as in the mosaic lettering. Then we go on to the 9th and 10th century. Here it starts to look better with some kind of a clear scribal manifestation. And this is called the Oriental script, or Oriental style, that developed around the Near East, from Babylon to Egypt, of course, Israel. And from this, the two major known styles of Hebrew developed. The first is the Ashkenazic style, developed mostly in Northern Europe, in France, in Germany, Eastern Europe later. It's very beautiful, very decorated, difficult to read, very high contrast. It was done with a quill, and it shows very heavy influence by the Gothic black letter of the time. And as I mentioned, it was developed in Northern Europe. In parallel, we've seen, or we know, the other style, which is the Sephardic. Sephardic is Spanish in Hebrew. And this was developed in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain, in Portugal, and Italy. It's somewhat less decorated, more readable, lower contrast, and this was done with a reed as opposed to the Ashkenazic. With the advent of print, in the 15th century, Hebrew was they started printing Hebrew quite quickly, around 1475. But from the very beginning, it was quite poorly done. Again, punch cutters and printers tried to imitate the handwriting, and apparently they were not looking at very good manuscripts. And therefore, it looked like that. We have very few good examples of Hebrew type design that was done later. Broadly speaking, I can say that from the, let's say, 16th, 17th, till the 19th century, most of Hebrew type was badly designed and poorly produced. This is one of the sole examples that are really beautiful. This was designed and cut by Guillaume Lebet in Paris in the 16th century. And I should remind you maybe that some of those flaws and deficiencies that I keep on mentioning relate to actually two reasons. One is the small market. It's a small market size, and it should be noted. And the other thing is the fact that up until the 20th century, most, if not all, Hebrew printing was biblical. It was only for religious causes. And again, it made a very small market in that sense. This all changed in the beginning of the 20th century with this type, the Frank Rule type, that really made a reform of the Hebrew type. It was designed around 1910 in Leipzig by Raphael Frank. And I don't think I should call it a revolution, but it was far better than anything that was done before. And I think it also reflects the changes in Jewish society becoming less and less religious. And there was more and more need for non-religious, more mundane, more secular printing. I won't go into details, but it also obviously had it reflected the reincarnation or the reinvention of the Hebrew language at around the same time, and the rise of the Zionist movement, the Jewish national movement. But what's most important for us is the fact that this typeface that was designed around 1910 is still today the most prevalent Hebrew text face. when I'm saying this, I mean that around 100% of Hebrew books are using this, are set with this typeface. And I would say 90–80% of the newspapers, magazines are set with this type. Then during the first half of the 20th century, we see the rise or the appearance of the release of the Hebrew Sans, and around mid-century we have a few very good and beautiful faces that were released. But if we go back, I do want to concentrate on the Frank rule, and if in thinking of text typefaces used for continuous reading, this is really the one and only reference. And when Hebrew speakers think of Hebrew, when they imagine Hebrew, this is what they see. This is what they imagine. Those are the letter forms. So this is where the history bit of my talk ends. And now we flow into the Noam Text story. So what did I want to do? I had two goals, two main ideas when I started. One is really to create an alternative to the Frank rule. I really resist this idea that one text face is enough. I mean, it's if like all of us had the same voice or tone of voice. It's not reasonable. I also wanted to create a text typeface which is dual script, Hebrew and Latin, which will enable us to, or enable designers, typographers, to implant a word or a short phrase or a sentence of Hebrew within a flow of a text of Latin to English or French or whichever language that uses the Latin script, and vice versa, of course. And this is a very common need in Israel, to combine the two scripts. What I wanted really is to do this without the one script be obtrusive. I wanted to create a harmony, to harmonize the scripts, but without deforming and changing each script. Maybe a quick word about typeface design in general, why I like it and why I think it's so interesting. It's really a microcosmos. It's really about looking on something which is really, really tiny. It's black and white, it's very simple, and it's about being super creative within a very, very restrict range. Because the forms are there, the skeletal forms are there, and one cannot do much with this. I mean, if you do too much, then it's not readable anymore. So there's a very tiny, a very narrow, limited, restricted range there, and this is why it's so beautiful, I think. So I remind you, one aim, one goal was really to create an alternative for the Frank rule, and really to break, to change, to end this hegemony. I also, I was looking at readability and hoping to create a typeface that is more readable than the Frank rule, but also try to create something which a typeface that has a lighter texture, more airy and lighter color, type color. So you see Noam Text on the right and the Frank rule on the left. If you thought the left one is better, don't tell me. So one thing was to deal with proper kerning, which was, at the time, at least when I started, was not very common with Hebrew. Another issue was letter differentiation. The Hebrew script, the alphabet, has quite a few couples and even trios of letters that are very, very similar one to each other. And it's a big issue, especially if you think of the size of the type. If you if you're reading 9-point size or 5-point size, then this tiny bit on the bottom right is crucial. So I tried really to create major differences in order to facilitate the reading. So here are some examples. And again, you should consider or think about it in this size or smaller, of course. The other thing is the vocalization marks. Hebrew has no vowels, so we use those diacritic marks in order to vocalize or to ease the reading, to facilitate reading. It is not very commonly used. It's used mostly for children books, for the Bible, and for poetry. Nevertheless, it has to be done properly. And if you look at the letter on the right hand and the diacritic mark beneath it, this is how it should look. And so the typeface is made in such a way that it is replaced on while you type for the correct vocalization marks. Another major understanding was that the Xheight of the two scripts should not align. Today, I think it's a common knowledge. I mean, everyone who's into Hebrew type design knows this. It's a best practice. It's clear. But I think that at the time when I started, and that was, when was it? Very long time ago. It was, I was maybe not the first, but one of the first who realized that as Hebrew is monocase, we don't have uppercase and lowercase, it needs to be so to speak, Xheight of the Hebrew needs to be somewhere in between the lowercase and the uppercase. Higher than the lowercase, lower than the cap height. Then we have punctuation marks. So basically, the forms are the same. If you look at the question mark with the Hebrew and Latin, it's the same skeletal form. And in most cases, if not all of them, in Hebrew type design, designers are choosing to use the Latin forms for the Hebrew, which is fine. You can do with this, but it's I think it's wrong. I think we should have proper design, bespoke design for the Hebrew punctuation marks, and therefore I designed all of them to work along the Hebrew as it should. And again, this is while you type Hebrew, you get those forms. When you type Latin, you get the others. And then there are the numerals, the numbers. If you look here, you can see that using the Latin numerals make them very present, very noticeable, very visible, too visible, for no reason, actually. You can spot them here. So it does make sense. So again, some designers today are using old-style figures, the Latin old-style figures, in order to make them sort of mix better with the Hebrew. But I thought it is worthwhile designing a specific set for the Hebrew. As you can see here, it merges, I think, better. And a closer look here. And they're different. It's not just smaller, it's different design. You can see it here. And also looking at the old-style figures, the Latin old-style figures, again, they're different. There's also a set for currency signs, symbols, and other punctuation marks, so it's an entirely different bespoke design. So the first goal was to create an alternative for the Frank rule, and the second one was to suggest a new solution, a new tool, basically, for designers to be able to really interweave the Hebrew and the Latin. And I can already say now that when I started, and I think Vic mentioned it, I was looking at the details. I was looking at similar details, but quite quickly I came to the understanding that it's not about the details. It's not about the terminals. It's not about it's about the overall texture. It's about the rhythm. It's about the color. It's not about the details at all. So for those of you who are not familiar with the alphabet, I will do a quick deviation here, a quick word about the challenge, actually, because the scripts are really different. They're really, really different one from the other. They have different DNA, different origins, backgrounds, histories. So first and foremost, the stress is different. The Hebrew is horizontal, the Latin is vertical. You see the thicks and the thins, so the thicks are horizontal and in the Hebrew, and the other way around with the Latin. Then directionality. Obviously, we read Hebrew from right to left and Latin from left to right, but it's not that. What's interesting is that if you look at the open counters, then you see that with Hebrew, you see the counters are so to speak, open from right to left. They leftward facing, whereas in Latin, it's the other way around. Extenders and caps. As I mentioned before, Hebrew is monocase. We don't have uppercase. And we also have very few extenders, descenders and ascenders. And those two issues have a huge impact on the interlinear space, on texture, as you, to some extent, can see here. And lastly, maybe the more important and crucial issue is the fact that with Latin, a huge number of letter forms are circular or oval, whereas in Hebrew, there are none. And maybe a word here about sans and serif. With sans serif Hebrew type, it's much easier to sort of harmonize all those issues, where in text type, it's much more difficult. So what I really wanted to create, and this is really important, I did the whole process from scratch, from its very inception, in tandem. I worked in parallel on the Hebrew and the Latin. It's not that I did something in Hebrew and then started working on the Latin. It was really working side by side all the way through, the two scripts together. And nowadays it's a bit different, but surely, again, when I did that at the time, if you had at all a dual script type family, it was always an existing Latin and a Hebrew that is trying somehow to look similar, but basically it was derivatives. And for me, this was really crucial. I didn't want to, so to speak, to sell the soul of Hebrew. I didn't want to betray the tradition, the heritage, the history, the nature. I wanted basically for you to read an English text without knowing, without imagining that it was created, designed in order to work with Hebrew, and the other way around, of course. What I really wanted is really a family of non-identical twins. So the use of, I mentioned that, but I'll say again that the use of bilingual text in Israel is very common, and it's really needed, this ability to mix the scripts. The beginning of the journey was really rough, and I'm going to show you some very difficult images, so take it easy. Initial sketches are really difficult to look at, embarrassing, very embarrassing, so I'll go very quickly through this. But I did want to show you the process. And so, as you can see, at the beginning, I really was trying to imitate and to look for similar details, like here, and use this silly idea of copy-pasting, or cut and paste. And slowly, hopefully, it became, very slowly, but it became better. And again, during this process, I understood that it's not about the details at all. It's really the texture and the spirit, so to speak. Obviously, it was a very long process, iterations, back and forth, tests, letter forms, spacing, kerning, etc. You know all about this. And this is more or less what came out in the end. I remind you that I was looking at the Frank rule. So we have here the Frank rule on the right and Noam Text on the left. And I wanted to create something that has a clear connection to history, to really the tradition of Hebrew, but also a very clear connection with the Frank rule, because it is so prevalent and we are so used to read it. So it made sense to make something that somehow echoes the conventions, the conventional forms that we know, but obviously something that evolves and is doing something else. Just one aspect is the counters. As you can see, they're much larger. The Noam Text is much more airy and lighter. And I hope it's fresh, it's different, it's new, it's lighter, as I said, and hopefully more readable. This is, again, the vocalization and the entire set. I'll go quickly through this. It's a pan-European typeface that supports many different languages with very beautiful forms like those. And again, the Hebrew with the special forms. But at the bottom line, the idea really, the aim that I had was really to be able to interweave a word or a short phrase in Hebrew, or in English in this case, into the Hebrew. And I think that technologically we did it quite okay, maybe not perfect, but quite easy to make. But I think that formally, I hope that it's working really nicely. And you can spot here the English in the Hebrew. And again, without betraying one or another. You can have an understanding here of the textures I mentioned and the way the two scripts are working together in a sort of a balance, equilibrium, but without imitating one the other. I thought about showing type in use, but I will take you into a small deviation, showing you a very, very special project I was involved with a few years ago in a very special location. It's the permanent exhibition of the Jewish, or it's the Jewish exhibition depicting or portraying the story of the Holocaust in Auschwitz, in Poland, in the museum. So I was in charge of the entire visual communication design of this project, alongside the chief designers, Hanan de Lange and Tal de Lange, and two of my colleagues, Yael Burstein and Oris Sukari. I will not go into the entire project, although I should say that it is I think it's the most important project I ever designed. But I will focus on this, which is the Book of Names. It's one of the main issues with the commemoration of the Holocaust is obviously collecting the names, the victims' names. It's an essential project. It's running for basically more than 6 decades now, 7 maybe, almost 6 decades. And up until now, they have 4.2 million names that were documented. And this is a significant achievement, of course, but it is really so difficult to express this idea of the vast number visually. How do you do it? So the designer, Hanan de Lange, designed this eternal tomb, so to speak, a tombstone for the Jewish children, the men and the women who were murdered in the Holocaust. And this is trying to express really this inconceivable number of victims. The names, the birth dates, if known, their origin, where they lived, and the place of death, if known. And it's basically a huge book. It holds 14,000 pages, and one can search for any specific name, to point at it, to touch it, to feel it. And Gustav Hilkovich is my grandfather, and Lucina is my grandmother, both murdered in the Holocaust. So for me, it was very personal, of course, but it's also, I think, an important project, and this is Noam Text in use. Yeah, I mean, the fact that the names of all those victims, including my personal close relatives, are set in a typeface that I have crafted in my own hands is meaningful for me. And with this, I'll start the third and last part of my talk, if only just that we won't end in a tragic note. So we move forward, looking at the process. So 15 years? A while ago, someone called me and said and asked me or suggested that I will participate in, and excuse my French, in an event called Fuck Up Nights. I don't know if you heard about it, but it's about people standing on stage and telling the crowd, the audience, about their failures. Needless to say, I said, I'm sorry, I can't do it because I never failed. And then I said, okay, let's think about it for a second. And then I said, maybe it's the typeface, which is a failure. And it made me think, and I started thinking about it. So is it a failure? So yeah, maybe. From many different respects, it might be a failure, because what's good about working for such a long time on a single project? And I think I'm insinuated during my talk that many things have changed during those 15 years. The scene completely changed, technology changed, challenges changed. So in many ways, maybe it's irrelevant by now. And things that were really a breakthrough 15 years ago are common knowledge today. And also thinking about the suffering of myself, of course, but also people around me. You know, it was heavy. It was really difficult, and frustration and complaining, etc. And heavy, like a very heavy type, like a heavy weight. But if someone said procrastination, I didn't hear that. But clearly, I didn't work on this for 15 years. Most of the time it was in drawers or in folders. Every once in a while I was looking at it. And it's basically, it's a kind of a monster. It grows and grows, you have to feed it. And it's kind of a process. The time goes by, and as time goes by, expectations rise. Because, you know, the guy's working on this for so long, it must be amazing. And as soon as you understand that, you're terrified, and then you take the time, right? And then this is how it works. It's a very interesting kind of process. But we can continue. So is it a failure? Maybe not. Is it a success? Maybe. It's there's a lot of good, I think, positive virtues in these values. It's about being very serious. I was very serious, earnest. I worked very, very hard. It's about aspiration and ambition. It's about high expectations, which is really important in my view. Trying to do something really prominent, really with an impact. It's about professionalism. It's about doing something really seriously and looking at the technology, the technological aspects of the design and quality. So being professional is important. Perfectionism. Is it perfect? It's never perfect, of course. One can continue working on and on and on, but when is a good time to end, to finalize a project? Maybe that's my cue. And it's also about letting go, which probably is my more important lesson. It's about liberation, giving up, understanding that it is not perfect and it will never be. And we haven't solved all the technological aspects. And surely there are some kerning pairs that are horrific, or maybe more than some. But it is important, this lesson of giving up, letting go. So with this, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank the TDC and Carol for having us here. I would like to thank the designers and illustrators who did those posters around you. They're all my former students at Bezalel, and they gave me an amazing gift, and I thank them. And they were generous enough, really, to design those wonderful images. And I should mention, maybe, it is a cliche, but it's true that I have learned so much from my students along the years, probably at least as much as they learned from me. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity, for this lifetime experience of being an educator, working in education, working with young designers and making them become great artists and designers and architects. And lastly, I would like to thank TypeTogether, Vic and Jose, for the never-ending patience, the tolerance, the goodwill, the support, the technological support, but also the mental and psychological support, and above all, yes, above all for the friendship. Conclusions. 15 years is not a good idea, but there's hope. There's hope. One can finalize a project. And this is Noam. This is my older daughter. She was 18-month-old when I started working on the project. And this is how she looks now, or a year ago or so. So a while had passed. And with this, I'm really thanking you for coming. Thank you.